nice introduction. Certainly this is kind of an honor for me to host a panel on heat and its health impacts. As he mentioned, I am the program manager for the Sustainable Cities Network within the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. And my job is to convene our regional cities and our Arizona communities on sustainability-related topics. So we talk a lot about green infrastructure, we talk about urban forestry, solar energy efficiency, water resources. And so heat and its health impacts is actually very important to my audience. But interestingly enough, when we talk to communities, it's more of an operational topic, more so than anything. And so this particular panel I'm very interested in hearing from, probably just as much as you are, because we're trying to raise the level of awareness and education with our communities when it comes to climate change, the social aspects of sustainability, specifically related to health, public health, and its local impacts, livability, and so forth. So this is very exciting for me to engage with these folks. I learned a lot through kind of the research process. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. And how this is going to work is we're going to provide introductions briefly. Because we have 5 panelists, I'm actually just going to give their name, title, and organization and allow them to provide kind of their own background for 1 to 2 minutes. So you get a flavor of kind of who they are and what they're doing and where they came from. We're going to end with Nancy, and then she's going to do a presentation for about 10 minutes with regards to extreme heat and climate. And then we'll go into our general panel discussion, and then take Q&A for the last 15 minutes or so. Nancy does have to leave a little bit early. She's going to sneak out on us. So we'll take some questions with regards to her presentation after her presentation. So if the panelists would like to join us up here, we allow them to eat a little bit before they and that's okay. We'll make it right. Well, I'm going to go out of order, but that's all right. Don't worry about that. So, and I would like to welcome you all to participate. This is a fairly large panel. So, Nancy, you want to help folk up there? Thank you very much. So, what I'm going to do, as I mentioned, if you could each, as I introduce you, just take 1 to 2 minutes and tell us a little bit about what you do for your organization at ADC, how it relates, obviously, to this particular topic, and a little bit about your educational background. So, we'll go ahead and start with Violsa Garisha. I practiced it. And she is a senior epidemiologist for Maricopa County. So, Alicia.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thanks for this opportunity. Yes, my name is Violsa Garisha, and I am with Maricopa County Department of Public Health. I am with the Office of Epidemiology. I am a senior epidemiologist in the office, and I do have a medical background as well as master's in public health. 3 decades of my work I have spent in public health, and I do bring experience also from overseas because a part of my life I spent overseas, and then in 91 I moved to Arizona with my family. So since then I have been working, I worked for a while for Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, and then Arizona Department of Health Services, and now the last decade I work for Maricopa County Department of Public Health. My focus has been in communicable diseases, and I lead now, or I'm in charge of food surveillance. However, in 2006, since 2006, actively working also in heat surveillance. And so in Maricopa County, we do have heat surveillance program, and I work exclusively on that with my team.
Great. Thank you. Welcome. Next, we have Brandy Mead. She is Human Services Program Manager for MEG, which is Maricopa Association of Governments. That's one of our regional planning organizations. So welcome, Brandy.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Yes, I do work for Maricopa Association of Governments in the Human Services Division. My area of focus is on homelessness, and for the past 10 years, I've been staffing a regional committee on homelessness that works with all the cities and towns across Maricopa County on planning and implementation of strategies to end homelessness throughout the region. So I've been very involved with anything related to homelessness, with a heat relief network that I'll be talking about since 2005. I've been involved with efforts to reduce the number of deaths among the homeless population due to the heat. My background, actually I have a business degree and work, but then quickly went into the nonprofit world and had a focus on affordable housing before going and working at that.
Thank you. Welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Sharon Harlan. She is professor for ASU's SHES, which is School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and she is also a senior sustainability scientist for ASU's Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. So welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you. So hello, everyone. I feel, in addition to those things, that I should also say I'm a sociologist, which explains the kind of research that I do around the issues of climate and health. For the past many years now, I've been working with the Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Project, better known as the CAP-LTER, on issues of urbanization and inequalities. I've been directing this rather large, sprawling, interdisciplinary project that has ranged from everything having to do with the co-development of the urban heat island with increasing social inequalities in the Phoenix region, all the way to inequalities of landscapes across neighborhoods, inequalities of temperature, and also the impacts of this, or the unequal impacts of this on human health in the Phoenix region.
Thank you. Welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Michael Chester. Mike is assistant professor for ASU's School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment, which is part of the Ira A. Fulton School of Engineering, and he's also a senior sustainability scientist for ASU's Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. That's quite a mouthful. So, welcome, Mike.
Thank you. So, thank you all for coming. I've been at ASU for about 3 years now, in my 4th year in civil and environmental engineering, the traditional discipline. I have for a while now studied how infrastructure systems produce energy and environmental impacts of large infrastructure systems, transportation, buildings, electricity, water, and how cities are designed to use those infrastructure systems and the impacts they create. Over the past year and a half or so, I have become and leading several NSF projects related to the design of infrastructure, the design of cities, and how those designs contribute to social vulnerability to heat, which is the nature of the questions that I'll be answering today. So we have several projects focused on the Southwest, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, and why those cities are designed the way they are, and how they ultimately contribute or mitigate vulnerability to heat. My background is in civil engineering. Prior to coming to ASU, I was at the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, as well as UC Berkeley as a postdoc. But my work, I would say, largely incorporates policy, behavioral aspects, and people into engineered systems, how those affect engineered systems.
Great, thank you. Welcome. Last but not least, we have Nancy Sulliver. She is our state climatologist for Arizona, out of the Arizona State Climate Office. She is also a research professor here at ASU's School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and also a senior sustainability scientist for ASU's Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. So welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. As a state climatologist, I provide climate data as well as climate information, and I try to provide some climate context to weather events. So that's mostly what I spend my time doing. I do a lot of presentations, talk to community groups and school groups about climate issues, climate change, monsoon drought, all kinds of things.
Wonderful. And I have the good fortune of engaging with Nancy. She attends our green infrastructure worker meetings and educates our community on all sorts of climate issues. So very excited. So at this point, we will ask all of our panelists to sit down while Nancy provides a brief presentation with regards to extreme heat, insulation, climate, and of course what Phoenix can expect in the next, 20, 30 years. So kind of set the stage for our discussion.
Actually, I'm not going to tell you what to expect. To the extent, except to the extent that what will happen in the next 20, 30 years is going to represent a lot of what's happened in the past in terms of extreme temperatures. I'm going to give you a little context and just, I have your definition following this. This is how the National Weather Service, the NOAA glossary defines an excessive heat warning in terms of what their criteria are. This is generally broad across the whole U.S. and in fact, I don't know if it's applied actually anywhere in the U.S. because it's so general. It's for us not meaningful. It's issued within 12 hours of the onset of the following criteria: heat index of at least 105 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 3 hours per day for 2 consecutive days, or a heat index more than 115 degrees Fahrenheit for any period of time. Most of the time in Arizona, the temperature exceeds the heat index because we don't have humidity high enough to get the heat index above the temperature. So, but in the monsoon period, that can change. So under this criteria, if this summer we had used those criteria, they would have issued 54 excessive heat index. And there isn't a single person who would have ever paid attention to it. So, I mean, we had all of this heat. We had really extreme heat here. Well, this is when we actually did have the warnings that were issued, and I believe there were only 2. So the Phoenix criteria, in general, and there's probably a little bit more fine-tuning that goes into this. There's a tool that they have that will help them do this. But in any case, they take the forecast maximum temperature and what the forecast models are predicting will be, apply it to this graph. So it changes from May 1st here all the way through the end of September. The thresholds change. So if we have really extreme temperatures at the very beginning, above 108, 109 here, then we potentially would have a warning at this point. Once we get to this part of the year, if it's only going to be 108 or 109, it's not necessarily such a big deal. The heat index threshold, however, is 110 degrees Fahrenheit for central Phoenix and the south central Arizona area. So if we have a heat index, so a combination of humidity and temperature that's above the 110 threshold, then they'll send an issue a warning. So in any case, this explains why we didn't have, except for the 2 that we had, because we got up in this area of temperature up here, in this end of July here. So they used to also include the minimum temperature as part of this, but they don't no longer do that. I believe they stopped doing that this year, according to the guidance that I saw. But this is nevertheless important, and you'll be hearing about why it's important from some of the other speakers a little bit later in terms of minimum temperature. So their guidance was exceeding 89 degrees for our minimum temperature, and as you know, we've exceeded that quite often. Only 4 times this year, however. So I've taken a bigger look at this picture. High temperature records that were tighter set, just looking at the last 5 years, 2010 to 2014, up until the end of September is where this ends. I didn't go all the way through today. So 187 new or tied records, and those temperatures that set those records vary between 81 degrees Fahrenheit and 121. And the reason that happens is it depends on where you are in the state. So when we're looking at these areas here, 120, 121, we're talking about Phoenix and the southwest desert for the most part up along the Colorado River. But for example, Mount Humphreys, a high temperature of 81 can be a new record because that's pretty unheard of at that time in elevation. So that's why we have such a big range. So you'll see it's increased. We sort of reached our peak here in 2012, and then we sort of dropped off on how many records were tighter set. And this is just basically between June 1st and the end of September. So you would think, as we have more and more high records, it's harder and harder to set a new record because the threshold just keeps moving up. And that's true, but as we get warmer temperatures, those records are also jumping up. So looking at Phoenix, which is I think where we're going to be spending a lot of our time focusing. So this is the number of days with the maximum temperature at or above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And our record number is 33 days back here in, I believe this was 2011. This year we only had 10 days. So it was actually a pretty cool summer. I know some of you don't think that, but it actually was a pretty cool summer. And a lot of this has to do with these increasing maximum temperatures. We've had these throughout the record, but we seem to be getting a few more recently. There's trends there, maybe there's not trends there, they go up and down. I try not to draw trend lines because then you ignore the data and just watch the trend line. That seems to be what we do, so I try not to put in trend lines. But again, and in this context, maybe more importantly, there is certainly a trend happening with the nighttime minimum temperature. And so we used to never have a 90-degree temperature. I mean, rarely, once in 1836 or 37. And then we have like 1, maybe 2. And then all of a sudden, in the past 10 years or so, we've started to see this going up to 12 degrees a year or 13. A couple of years we had in a row we had 13. Our record is 15 degrees last year, and then this year we only had 4, which again, as I said, it was pretty cool. Pretty cool. So kind of looking back now at what are these extremes, the highest maximum temperature in Phoenix. I'm just going back, not counting when the station was at the city, but when it was just at the airport. So we have 115, 116 back here. They happen, and they're continuing to happen. Our record is 122 back in 1990. I believe we were at 119 last year. This year, I think we only got to 116. But we're still seeing these. But then this is potentially a more important value for us in the Phoenix area is this increase in the nighttime temperatures. What was the highest nighttime temperature back in 48? It was less than 85, and we're seeing a pretty steady increase in that as we go forward, and that's a concern. It's not limited, however, to just Phoenix. We look at Bullhead City, which is the place that typically has the most high temperature records constantly happening. It's usually the place when they say, what was the high for the nation, if you don't count Death Valley. Bullhead City is usually right up at the top of the list. And so Bullhead City's highest temperature is 126 degrees. They hit that a couple of times. But they have these exceedance of 97 is their highest temperature that they've had. And so they get up into the 90s as well. So it's not just something that only happens because of the heat island. And to a large degree in Phoenix, that's one of the main causes of that. And then just this last comment I want to make is that this isn't the Weather Service forecast for what's going to happen at Sky Harbor. Okay, so Sky Harbor is right in here, and so that's what they're forecasting for. But the reality is we have huge variation in what happens around the valley. So we have cool pockets and hotter pockets, and there's places hotter than Sky Harbor. I know some people find that hard to believe, but there certainly are. So we have 113s down here, 108 here, and there's 103 up this way. I was looking earlier. So there's quite a bit of variability, 8 to 10 degrees around the valley. So that's something important. It depends on where you live, and a lot of that is microclimate and neighborhood related, and that's something Sharon's going to be talking a lot about. So that's all I have.
Because Nancy has to leave a little bit early today, we thought we would field any questions currently right now with regards to her presentation and the information she provided. So somebody wasn't left out in the cold, so to speak. So, yes?
I have a question about the threshold temperatures that you use. Do you know if they correspond to a particular percentile of the historical record?
Yes, they do. Is it the 95th, 93rd? 97th percentile.
Okay, thank you. And that's,
So as the record gets hotter and hotter, that threshold is going to creep up as well.
okay, and that's just temperature, not heat index?
Yes, that's just.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So Nancy, I have a question that will help us. We're working on the Arizona Town Hall report on transportation for next spring. What do you see as the effect of climate change on 120-degree days where airport operations get restricted? Does the urban heat island effect counteract the climate change effect by spreading the heat out over the day and maybe pulling the very high temperatures down a little? I've heard that theory.
I haven't.
All 2014 has a paper on Phoenix that looks at that.
Which does?
David Hondula et al. 2014.
Okay.
So yeah, a little bit of that kind of radiator effect where the urban heat island is sucking some of those, shaving some of those peak temperatures perhaps at the daytime, and then shifting them towards, the night times or the minimum temperature. So
Well, to the extent that the built-up surfaces absorb the heat and in fact conduct it down below, it in fact acts as an oasis. So we have some oasis effect in central Phoenix relative to the surrounding deserts, where all the heat is kept at the surface, making the actual air temperature higher. So we do have some of that mitigation happening just because we have all these built surfaces. And then of course it comes back to bite you later when it's slowly released at night. So yes, from that standpoint, the built environment can keep those temperatures down a little bit. But if you have a lot of shade trees and you don't let the sun hit the surface in the first place, you can mitigate a lot of that.
Any other questions for Nancy? Okay. Thank you very much. That was a good way to kind of set the stage for, I think, our discussion. I know when I was looking at some of the, just kind of researching the topic and whatnot, I ran across a statistic on MAG's website that came from the National Weather Service specifically, and it mentioned that Phoenix averages 110 days each year over 100 degrees, which you kind of touched on that with your comparisons between the inland and the maximum temperatures. Certainly that has a tremendous effect on our population and our vulnerable communities. So to start the discussion amongst our panels, Sharon, I'm going to start with you. And I was wanting to know if you could address how is the extreme hot temperature a health hazard for people in central Arizona and possibly other areas of our state?
Well, I think I can address that best by contrasting it with the kind of cities that most people are familiar with, which are temperate cities, loosely defined as cities that have 4 seasons where most people live. So extreme heat is a hazard in those cities because it is episodic and unpredictable, better known as heat waves. So there are very specific times when this happens, and the way you prepare for that is through emergency services. Now, if you think about Phoenix, we have that because, relating back to what Nancy showed, we have those spikes. But we also have predictable heat every year, which is chronic and sustained. So what our research shows is that, people here are at risk all the time in this heat. The temperatures at which people's health begins to be affected by heat is much below what our average high temperatures are. So we have that, and we have the advantage of we can plan and we can build and we can think about heat as a chronic hazard, but we also have the problem that Nancy referred to and that Ken Waters is very familiar with at the National Weather Service, message fatigue. So people don't pay attention to the health.
So with that, they don't pay attention. Obviously, one of the ill effects is
can you help, and perhaps you'll say you can help with that as far as defining what that specifically, those two terms mean with regards to extreme heat?
With regards to extreme heat, we do have, I mean, heat can be, it's a silent killer. That's how we kind of, in the area that we track the disease, the illness and also the deaths that they are associated, we consider as a silent killer because every other hazard, environmental hazard, leaves the destruction behind. When we have the hot weather, people that they may die, but we hear probably later or we may not hear because a lot of them, some of them they go unrecognized. So so that's something that we in surveillance we kind of keep in mind, and we try to track as to work tracking. So heat can cause really deaths, can be as far as causing deaths and also illnesses. And we do know, based on our analysis that we have done in hospital, using hospital discharge data from our emergency departments, and we looked at that data, and we've seen that since 2008 to 2012, there have been 7,758 emergency department visits as a result of exposure to heat. And the level of illness or injury could be as dehydration and to heat stroke and so on. So the levels are but from all of those, what we found out, it was that 78% of those visits ended up patient being discharged the same day. 22% of patients, they had more serious injuries and they were admitted for treatment. So.
Okay. Now, with regards to those illnesses, are there delayed impacts for illnesses? I mean, is this something where you are affected right away, or are there like 1 or 2 days later you see the impacts of that? Is that something that any of you see?
I think I mean the delays can be probably in the deaths. They may feel that, but then the death may occur like a few days later or so. But with injuries, probably if they have been exposed for a longer time, depends on their status, on their health status and so on. Some of them they may be affected immediately. Some of them they may be exposure continues that they may.
Okay. Now with Maricopa County Department of Public Health, you track the associated deaths. So can you talk a little bit more about that process that you use to kind of keep track of all of this information? You've mentioned kind of these hospital records and so forth. Is there more to it?
Yes, we do. Since 2006, we started our heat-associated death surveillance, which it was right after in 2005, if you remember, we had that big kind of going on regarding the deaths in Maricopa County of homeless population. So we had like in 9 consecutive days they occurred 35 deaths, and so at the high temperatures 116 and Fahrenheit. So that was the time when we decided to start tracking these. And we got in collaboration with the Office of Medical Examiner's Office, and then received from them information weekly on suspect cases. So that's how we started, and our surveillance process has evolved since that year, and we believe we are at the point now that we really have such a great relationship with them. We track all deaths that they may have been certified by medical examiner. We track them and we know about those deaths. As of today, we have 652 confirmed deaths since 2006, which means those are either heat caused or heat related. And heat cause, we consider those deaths that in their cause of death, or their, it was heat, environmental heat was the main cause or immediate cause, and heat-related are the ones that the heat may be contributing to their death. So that's what we do. We do get also from healthcare providers information, but less than regarding the deaths. One thing, heat-associated deaths or illness in Arizona are not reportable. They are not required, which would be nice to have that. So we have to look for information to get, you know, the thing that is with medical examiner and hospital discharge data, downside is that those are more delayed information, especially with hospital discharge data, because we get a year later the final data from hospitals. So that doesn't give you a real-time data. However, with medical examiner, we do receive information, let's say timely, but that information is again delayed until medical examiner certifies the death. So that's, I just want to add one more thing. I know we are working on syndromic surveillance, which syndromic surveillance is basically something that it's called biosense, and CDC will be providing us, we are just in the process of getting the data from that, and this means that all our healthcare providers, actually local hospitals from here, they will be reporting to CDC, and then that data will be coming to local health departments. So that would be a more real-time data that we would be having.
Right. Okay, thank you. Now, with regards to the information, do you work closely with Brandy at MAG? I know there's a lot of working relationships there. So, okay. So, Brandy, I know you have a wonderful program with regards to the homeless and heat-related illnesses. Can you talk a little bit, you know, as far as MAG's perspective on that, and then also about your heat-related network? You have a nice mapping application, and how that works to provide relief, I guess, to our local communities. You want to address that?
Yes, thank you. So we started the Heat Relief Network in 2006 as a result of the deaths that Bioka spoke about in 2005. During that 9-day period, there were 35 homeless individuals that died on the street as a result of the heat. And there was national news about the number of deaths. There really was an outcry in the community that we needed to mobilize and do something to prevent heat-related deaths among the homeless population. Do something at that point, and then work toward doing something in the future to prevent those deaths. So we worked with nonprofit communities, faith-based organizations. We worked with businesses, and really just carrying volunteers across the community to create the network. The network, we have heat refuge locations, and we have water cooling stations across the community. So a water cooling station is a place that an individual, it could be a homeless individual, but really any vulnerable population can go to access water. We found that, especially among the homeless population, they didn't have any access to water, and so they weren't able to keep themselves hydrated during the day, and so we offered those, the water resources to them. We also found that during that 9-day period, we had high daytime temperatures, but the nighttime temperatures were high as well. So during those 9 days, there really was no cooling off period, and so the body temperature didn't have that opportunity to go down. And for homeless individuals that didn't have any refuge in the evening, were impacted by that. So we partnered with the faith-based agencies and homeless shelters to expand refuge locations and create an indoor place for homeless to go and spend the night and cool off, get water, and in some cases resources. So churches opened their doors and would allow people to come in and spend the night. We had some nonprofit agencies and homeless shelters that would basically throw mats on the floor and allow people to come in and get out of the heat. So we have grown the network from 2006. We had about 20 partners. We have tripled that, and we have over 70 partners now. And the network runs from June until September. And we offer these resources. We also have a map that has collection sites across the region. So if someone wants to donate to the network, you could donate bottled water, you could donate other resources. Then the map locates or provides those resources or those locations where you could go to drop off those resources. We also have another map which highlights the hydration and refuge sites across the community. So those are available on our website. We also partner with homeless outreach teams so that the outreach teams can distribute those maps when they're doing outreach to the homeless in the community so that they know where those locations are. We've also partnered with 211 Arizona, which is a resource and referral line for the state. And they have the maps and are able to, if someone is calling for assistance, they're able to give the location of a refuge site or hydration site.
Now, can I ask you,
Sure.
You mentioned the homeless, obviously that's a large portion of who probably uses those locations. But what if somebody's air conditioning goes out? Because as I was doing my research, I ran across a story about a gentleman who was the first fatality for this year, and it was an older gentleman in his 60s who had some health complications, but it was heat-related death, and his air conditioning was not functioning. So is that a service that people can use even if they have a home, but their air conditioning isn't functioning and a temporary refuge?
Yes, absolutely. The refuge locations are open to anyone who is in need of that refuge, as are the hydration stations across the community. The Salvation Army is also very involved, especially when there's an excessive heat warning in effect. The Salvation Army will, they'll have the tents around the community where they're providing additional resources on those days. And I know that the older adults, I know Vioka has done some research in looking at the deaths. Yes, the homeless population is impacted, but also finding out it's seniors in their homes who maybe aren't able to pay for air conditioning. They don't have their air conditioning turned on, and have seen a high number of deaths among that population as well.
Can I ask how does MAG actually incorporate this into their kind of longer term planning? I'm kind of curious as to that. If it touches other areas such as transportation, some of the other services that you provide.
Honestly, we, within the Human Services Division, we plan around this issue, but as far as impacting the transportation planning that MAG has works on, we have not bridged that gap, but I think that that's something that I'm here to learn from all of the panelists as well, and can take that back to MAG and see how we can incorporate that.
Sure, that's great. That's what it's all about, right? Making connections. Great. Well, I'm going to transition over to Mike because I think there's a really important research component, and even MAG and Maricopa County have been involved in certain capacities with regards to furthering our knowledge about extreme heat, its impacts specifically. And Mike, obviously you focus a lot on the built environment, sustainability, vulnerabilities, and I'm quite impressed by the wide range of topics that you've been able to touch on, such as energy and water and overall sustainability. So can you, I guess more broadly, explain to the audience about your research project that you're doing in LA and kind of how that relates to Phoenix and some of the findings that you've found so far?
Yeah, so a couple years ago, I got together with a medical doctor at UCLA and an urban planner at UCLA. And we were sitting down in the room and we were talking about sort of what are the kind of research questions that we wanted to tackle related to heat. And we sort of zeroed in on this area that seemed to be wide open, which is how do the design of cities contribute to social vulnerability to heat? And I'm not talking about urban heat island. I'm talking about how is it that we've designed our cities in a way that delivers cooling resources to people, whether that be in the form of air conditioning or water or electricity for air conditioning, so it could be directly or indirectly. This space was largely untouched, so this is where our project comes in. We're contrasting Los Angeles and Phoenix, and we're asking questions about 4 components in particular, and those components are cooling centers, which was just mentioned, and I'll try to get into a little bit of detail. As simple as we thought that was, it turned out to be far more complicated after talking to some of these folks who are much wiser than us on that topic. Air conditioning access. So in Phoenix, virtually all buildings have air conditioning, but in a place like Los Angeles, which also has forecasts for more extreme heat events, less so. The third one is electricity generation. So as things get hotter and drier, which are what all the forecasts are saying, our ability to generate electricity may be compromised. And actually, as our research progresses, that's exactly what we're seeing. We need water to generate electricity, and our ability to do that as water sources become constrained means that we're running closer and closer to the margins of how much electricity we can generate for, say, air conditioning. And the last one are just the sort of physical layout of the buildings. So when we have designed buildings, it's unclear if we've designed them for a much hotter future. And the thermal characteristics of the building, the materials that we chose, the windows that we use, the insulation that we provide, may or may not be optimal or may not be sufficient for a hotter future. So we're taking these 2 cities, and across those 4 components, we're asking, how is it that in a future, say today, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, these components may be more vulnerable, may make people more vulnerable to heat.
How does Phoenix compare as regards to Riparian?
So
It's a trick question.
it's a big question. Yeah. So some interesting things. I'll start with cooling centers. So we just heard about county cooling centers. So we started with this idea that there are sort of public cooling centers where people can go to, and people certainly do go to them. And if you draw a map, if you look at a map of the city and you look at these cooling centers, there's about 30 sort of county-sanctioned cooling centers in Phoenix and roughly equivalent in Los Angeles. As you all know, these are obscenely massive cities, on the order of 100 miles by 100 miles in any direction. And when you plop down 30 cooling centers spread out somewhat uniformly, there's not much coverage at all. And then when you ask the question of who are the types of people who could potentially walk to those cooling centers at a very low speed when it's 105 to 120, and you draw like a radius out from there, it's not very much at all. So there's a lot that's not covered by these county cooling centers. But that's only the beginning of the story. So after kind of pitching this to some of these folks, they said, well, there's a lot of other ways in which people access cooling centers. So, we've been thinking about these sort of ad hoc cooling networks, those being places like libraries and churches, places like commercial centers, like Scottsdale Fashion Square Mall. Some of us who have enough income can decide to spend a really hot day at the mall and maybe buy something, maybe not buy something, but this is a place where we can experience reprieve from heat. So what we're finding in both of those cities, one similarity, is that when you sort of overlay, let's start with places of worship, which are dominated in the United States as churches, what you find is that low-income neighborhoods, our sort of preliminary results are showing low-income neighborhoods tend to be serviced by places of worship, whereas medium to higher income places tend to be serviced by commercial establishments. And this could include a bar where you go and buy beer, it could be a place where you go shopping, or some other form. So that's some of the similarities we're seeing. In Los Angeles, in Phoenix, what we're seeing is almost 100% penetration of air conditioning, but as Sharon has raised the question to me before, who can afford to turn it on is a serious question to ask. In Los Angeles, you don't nearly see the same penetration of air conditioning. And in Los Angeles, you have the ocean on one side to essentially Phoenix-like conditions on the east side. And what we're trying to do is sort of map the relationship between when infrastructure was put in, and it tends to be that when older infrastructure went in, it tended not to have as much central AC or even window AC. Whereas newer infrastructure, which is what you get sort of in sprawling LA to the east, you tend to have a fair amount of air conditioning. So, you know, what we're seeing is this sort of big disparity in who has access to air conditioning, and our questions are naturally related to, well, who needs that air conditioning, which is where we're going to now. In terms of electricity generation, it's important to recognize that Phoenix, Arizona, even Los Angeles, California, are not electricity islands. Matter of fact, we export a lot of our electricity to California. We are a net exporter. California is a net importer of electricity. So what we did is we said, geopolitical boundaries are meaningless. I mean, looking at Phoenix, looking at Arizona is really not the right way to do this, because for reliability reasons, electricity is generating at a large scale. Matter of fact, we're in a grid that includes the entire West. And we decided to look at the West as a region, and when we do that, we see pretty significant implications. So I was talking to one of my students earlier, and he was saying, you could potentially get a 10%, up to a 10% reduction in your ability to generate electricity. And to put that in context, we have a margin of excess capacity that's about 10% of our demand today. So take that away, and we're pretty much running at capacity. And this is thermoelectric power plants, and then we all have seen the pictures of reservoirs that have very little water in them. And the question is, once it gets low enough, it gets below that intake pipe, and then you can't generate electricity with that. So these are, sort of preliminary findings that we're seeing so far.
Great. Now, I know Sharon, with regards to some of the research that you're doing, I'm kind of getting the impression that Arizona is ahead of the curve when it comes to the extreme heat research, some of the knowledge with regards to climate and so forth. And would you agree with that assessment? And also, can you tell me a little bit about some of the research that you've done with regards to neighborhoods and the individual experience temperatures, the eye buttons, because that's very progressive, I think, and has a lot of application elsewhere.
Sure. So are we ahead of the curve?
And
yes.
You can agree to disagree.
Yeah, I was thinking that probably 10 years ago when my group first got our grants and got this research program started on heat. So a forum like this wouldn't have happened, and all these things, surveillance system, the homeless program, research, these have all come online since then. And I think the audience probably wouldn't be here either, because the sentiment was, it's hot in Phoenix, we know that, so what? So in that sense we are. On the other hand, I would say we have been an inspiration to other places, because there's just a ton of research on heat in cities now, in the United States and around the world. So there's a great deal of interest in this. Has to do, of course, with forecasts of what's likely to come. So that's my assessment of, yes, we're out in front. We have a lot to teach. We can also learn from other places. And what's important now are these, I think, cross collaborations. We're studying multiple cities. So I'm involved in some of those, and my institute, I think that's important. So as to the research that you asked me about, let me see here. I have this little sensor. Individually experienced temperature. So I sent over one slide. Do you have that slide? I could put this in a little bit of context about where these sensors fit into a larger picture. So as part of our project, we have used some of the kinds of data that Yosha is talking about, and we've created a vulnerability index for neighborhoods across the metropolitan area. And the vulnerability contains certain factors like the socioeconomic status, the income, the race, the access to air conditioning coverage and so forth, the elderly, people who live alone, and landscapes, unvegetated land cover, which is part of a large part of my research project. So where the socio-economic vulnerability is high and the vegetation is low, that's where we see the highest temperatures, and that's also where we see the heat deaths. So the green circles represent heat deaths, and the larger circle with more deaths. So that's where people live who are dying from heat. Okay? But that's pretty much what we know about them. That's where they live. What were they doing? What caused them to die? There's other ways we need to investigate this, and Biosha is doing some important things with the death certificates. We had this idea that we could investigate the living too. And so CAP-LTR is funding an undergraduate, really, who came from Boston University and tried this out in a neighborhood in Boston, where they outfitted people for a week with these little temperature sensors, which you wear on your clothing all the time, 24/7. And David Hamdullah, who's out of town today, actually they're both at a meeting. Evan Kuras is the undergrad, and Dave Hamdullah is the principal advisor for this. They're both at a meeting presenting this new research. So we did this in Phoenix, just finished up a week in September, when we were fortunate to have a day that was 108 degrees, and some other weather conditions. And he's got a team of undergraduates working on this, and they recorded this, I think records every 5 minutes or something, your ambient temperature wherever you are. And they also are doing interviews with the people on a nightly basis to track, where they are, what kinds of activities they're engaged in. And this gets at will get at a couple of important questions. In terms of variance within neighborhoods. Okay, so again, you have people that are exposed to similar conditions, but what makes the difference in terms of, who lives or who gets sick or who's heat stressed. So I think this adds another dimension, and numerous groups around the country are talking about trying the same thing. This opens up a black box that epidemiologists have had of just looking at the temperature and the number of deaths, or the place and the number of deaths. Well, what are people actually doing? So starting out on relatively small scales, I think Evan did 25 people in Boston. They've done 90 people here in the metro area in 5 different neighborhoods, and bigger plans ahead.
So did you say when some of those findings will be available?
So the findings from Boston, which I can't say enough about Evan's and his creativity in trying this in Boston. That was his senior thesis, by the way. So he and David Hamdullah have an article that's in revision right now for the International Journal of Biometeorology, and so probably within a year these things will be published, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to people in the meantime about what they're finding.
That should be exciting. I'm sure that's something that can be distributed through kind of this network, and of course through ASU, through the CAP program.
Through the CAP
They're very good about promoting that. That's wonderful. Well, with all these exciting developments, how do you see best using all of this knowledge and all of these actions by your agencies? I mean, what do you see cities and individuals, what kind of strategies do you see them as far as implementing and kind of moving ahead, making a bigger difference, having a bigger impact? Because the goal is 0 deaths, really. And of course, illnesses, that seems to be, Sharon, you, in our conversation, you called it a canary in the coal mine, kind of the tip of the iceberg. I mean, that's not even been really researched, it seems like, very extensively. So what do you see as those kind of next steps, and what can cities and individuals do to minimize our impact?
So,
Anybody?
oh, okay. So, well, the canary in the coal mine, I think of this in a number of different ways, but one is like when underground miners are going into a mine and they're afraid of the toxic fumes they'll take, the canary is respiratory system is much more sensitive, the canary will die first, and that gives them a warning. I think when we research vulnerable populations and the people who are dying from heat right now, unfortunately, one way to look at this is these are the canary in the coal mine. And with the increasing exposure that we expect to have with heat, the unknown future, this is really becoming a wider and wider problem where all of us are going to be exposed. And we need to think about emergency services, and we need to think about longer term planning. And I have my ideas about that, but you have other people who are thinking about emergency services and long-term planning. So,
I'll just mention, as far as the homeless population, I'm very interested in all the research that's being conducted right now to see what we can learn from that research and how we can apply that knowledge into some additional resources for the homeless population. I also think that awareness about the dangers from the heat and the number of deaths that have occurred, I think it's very important to be talking about that. Because we deal with the heat on a daily basis over the summer, I think there is that tendency to not think of it as a potential danger. For the homeless population, and what can people do for that population, I think just being aware if you see someone who appears to be in stress on the heat and they're homeless, to speak with them, ask them if they're okay, if they're in need of resources, and know that we do have resources available throughout the community, and you can point them to those networks. There was a story that was done in the newspaper a couple of years ago about a homeless gentleman who was sitting on a bench in front of the Herberger Theater in downtown Phoenix, and he had been sitting there all day, and people had been walking past him all day long. He had died on the bench, and because he was homeless, there's a tendency to walk by homeless individual and not acknowledge them, or even in some cases even notice them. So he had gone unnoticed all day long on that bench, and he had died there. And at some point in the evening, he was found. But something could have been done to prevent that death. And the Heat Relief Network was in place during that summer. And had he known about that network, had he known about those resources, then maybe that death could have been prevented.
Just related to everything that was said in here, I just want to put something in context, and I hope it's true. We are seeing a reduction in number of heat-associated deaths. In 2012, confirmed cases reached the number 110 per year. Well, in 2013, they were only 74, and now this year, so far, we have confirmed 20. As of today, we have 20 confirmed cases. I don't know where the story, probably it has something to do with all efforts as a community we are putting on. Probably because, even though we do have around 50 cases that they are still under investigation, but based on what we know previously, how many cases they go, 50% of cases that they are under investigation that get confirmed. Again, I'm assuming that this year we won't be reaching the number that we had before. So I think personally that's a good news. I really appreciate and kind of all these efforts and also network that we have. It's more than ever that we have collaboration with university, with MAC and City of Phoenix and Heat Relief Network. We were for years, because we were interested as public health to put out there the numbers so people they can use them for for their prevention efforts. And we will continue to do that and find that, but I think it's a good direction. I really am excited.
Mike, what do you think?
I mean, I think we continue to build our cities like it's 1950 or 1970, as Sharon showed us with the temperature data when things weren't all that hot. And as evidence mounts that it's going to be hotter, that it's somewhat unavoidable, and that people are vulnerable, maybe there's ups and downs, we continue to, I think, make only marginal improvements in how we think about the design of our cities. And I don't think this is the fault of engineers alone. I think that this is sort of an interdisciplinary problem. I think it requires us as policy and decision makers, as infrastructure managers, as city managers, to recognize these issues, that people will continue to be vulnerable, may become more vulnerable, and there needs to be some sort of fundamental rethinking about the principles in which we use not only to build things, but to protect people. And I think that urban heat island, we tend to be heavily focused there, and that's great, but I think there's only a little piece of it. I think there's a lot more that we could be doing directly to be protecting people.
Sure.
So I have one more comment. As the sociologist, I think that, in a way, heat is one more tribulation, one more inequality that's layered on top of an existing social structure, and it affects the most vulnerable people who are already vulnerable. And this is where we should be thinking about taking the first actions, maybe to protect those canaries, in terms of making sure that they do have access to air conditioning and affordable and quality housing, and that to address the issues of climate change in our city, in our metropolitan area, in our state, it really means relooking at policies that are a lot broader than just those that are concerned with heat.
I would like to open it up for questions at this point, because we have some folks that have to leave right at 1:30. And so I realize that my questions are not the same as your questions, and so I'd like to kind of open it up from here. So, the lady in the back.
Hello, I'm interested in open data, and I also work with several nonprofits.
Can you speak up?
I'm very interested in open data, and I'm also affiliated with several nonprofits, and I'm curious to know what other data sets or statistics are available to the general public so that we can mobilize nonprofit resources in a more effective and efficient manner. You mentioned a couple of the statistics you have available. I'm just kind of curious what other data sets are available.
I mean, the hospital discharge data is available. I think then that database is available. Biosense data will be available pretty soon. Out there is also that we found out, and we are just piloting right now. It's preclinical data sets that are coming from fire departments, and we have been looking at that data and comparing the heat depths, and the pattern, it seems similar, but this is just the beginning of it's still to do some more analysis. But these are the data sets. I think I just want to mention one thing, that at this point, since we started tracking the heat-associated deaths, I think indoor deaths are the most, concerning. Older population is dying indoor, and all of them, they are associated with lack of air conditioning. So, which is sad, and really, I really think that efforts have to, the outdoor population, homeless population, fortunately this year we haven't seen any, but outdoor we do have 10 deaths, they occurred, however, no homeless, which means the efforts, something is working. However, really at this time, it's indoor population and older population we are seeing and always, whenever you read those reports, they have to do either the utilities were cut off or if no air conditioning and things like that. So it's.
We've created a website, interactive website, coolme.today, www.coolme.today, when we started the work about a year ago, in the summer, there's some overlap, Randy, with what you guys are doing, we said, okay, what cooling centers are available to the public? And if you go to any county website, maybe prior to this year, they got a little bit more progressive this year. To find cooling centers, you had to go like 3 links deep to a PDF that was a PDF of an Excel table of some sort, where you had to somehow make sense of 10 pages of addresses to figure out what was the closest resource to you. So we said, let's put this in an interactive Google map, which is what the website is. We started with Phoenix, and we mapped all the cooling centers, county-sanctioned cooling centers. Then we added Los Angeles, and it quickly took off, so the National Weather Service got really interested in it. We now have all of Southern California, I think all of Arizona, I think Tucson is in there as well. And we've basically created a open data repository where any city, county, agency, whatever, can give us their data, and we'll be happy to upload it. One of the challenges that we face is that if something is a cooling center, or something being a cooling center, tends to change pretty frequently. So it's tough for us to constantly be mining websites for this sort of information. So we welcome you guys to help contribute to that.
Sharon, are there sources from CAP-LTR as well that are available as far as open data?
Well, there's a lot of temperature data around.
Okay, Nancy.
Yeah, there's a lot of climate data.
Yeah, there's a lot of climate data. And actually, so Bill was talking about the health data sets. So to actually use those, you need a lot of security approvals and so forth. But there are reports published, like the county publishes these reports on the death data each year, and the state, Arizona Department of Health Services, has now analyzed the hospitalization data, and that's up on their website. So without actually analyzing the data yourself, and that's true for the climate data too, you can access a lot of reports from state and county that give lots of information.
And just to add to that, we do have the data request form that is on our public website. If you are interested and, go and submit your request, and we'll try to meet your needs. The other thing, the reports are there. They are since 2008. Right now we are working on multi-year report. So we hope that this multi-year report will shed more light on, because every year you have such smaller numbers that you can make kind of conclusions, and so hopefully with this multi-year report, which we believe that by the end of the year will be ready, then that will
Great. Okay. Same lady right here.
Regarding the building standards, is there something that you either worked on or approved, because LEED standards are national and don't have these kind of pressures, climate pressures, and I don't see a lot of digestion of like really progressive solutions.
Yeah, so this is, so to be open, we're just beginning this phase of questions. So we're right at the beginning, and give us 6 months and I probably have answers to you. So the things that we're thinking about though are the quality of the building shell, as we would call it. So what the walls are made out of, what's inside the walls, things like that. The types of windows, when did the windows go in? So the question that we're really trying to get at is, if you take a household or a person who's vulnerable and you put them in a 1970s apartment building that's likely to warm more quickly versus a year 2000 apartment that's likely to stay cooler longer, you might suspect that the former is potentially more vulnerable. That might contribute to their vulnerability. So there's certain characteristics that we're thinking about in the building shell, the windows, the framing of the building, and so on. So ultimately, what we'd like to get at is, are there certain characteristics of buildings that are able to keep cool air in longer, ultimately resulting in less air conditioning demand for that person, less cost for somebody who might be low income.
Yeah, I was wondering if any of you could address public policy, and if your work is actually impacting any municipalities' choice on any policy decisions. How's that reflected?
I'll speak specifically for, I know there's been a lot of work in the city looking at solutions for the homeless population, and obviously getting them off the street and putting them into permanent housing is what ends homelessness, and wrapping services around them. And so there's been a lot of funding that's coming from the cities to take people that are on the street that are chronically homeless off the streets and put them into housing, and then provide them with services, pay for their utilities so that they can have utilities while they're in that housing as well. So I have seen a shift. City of Phoenix has been very involved with the Heat Relief Network, and they've it started with the homeless population, and now they're pivoting and really looking at the older adults and what they can do for that population as well. And so I have seen other cities kind of learning from what they're doing as well and starting to come on board.
So I have two ways in which, well, there are different ways in which my project has worked with public policy. One is working with a low-income neighborhood who's having problems with their park, which was very dry and unvegetated, and working with them to use the research to convince the appropriate authorities that they should have trees. So this is really important in terms of working with the grassroots and getting their goals implemented for their communities. And another thing we're engaged in right now is we are working with the National Weather Service in Phoenix, and we're trying to look at the warning system that they have, which Nancy showed you how that works, and trying to integrate some of the health data into that warning system so that it can be known, oh, well, if you have this kind of weather, you're likely to have this kind of health outcome. And so this is a conversation that's going on here and other places around the country about how we warn and communicate with people.
And we're somewhat focused on delivery. I think we're too early to say that we've had a policy impact at this point. You guys are just realizing that we exist. We're trying to move towards at least a way in which we could make recommendations about, if you're a city or an agency that has a finite budget, and you're looking to protect people by investing in infrastructure or investing in protecting them from heat, how would you most cost effectively do that? And I think that question is still somewhat open. I think we have certain socioeconomic strategies that we can think about. We are getting better at identifying what the population subgroups are that might be vulnerable. But once we know that, what are the tools at our disposal? What are the opportunities at our disposal to protect them? That's what we're trying to say. One or more is, or one or the other is maybe more or less cost effective.
I'll take a couple more questions. No.
Me? Okay. Oh, cool. Well, there was talk of the indoor deaths due to the lack of AC or not being able to afford AC. And I'm just curious if the utilities are involved with any of these projects, because it seems like they should be a partner in these.
About utilities probably Rainy might be able to talk more, but I just can mention that medical examiner came and we were able to, we just started tracking down since 2006 how many of those cases were related to utilities. So we are in the process of finding out that part, and we reached out to Meg to see what we can do, what can be done, how we can, what can be done with those type of situations.
And I think we're still trying to get them engaged in this topic. I've asked some of the utility companies what their policies are, and what I've heard is that they have a policy, if there is an extreme heat warning, that their policy is to not turn off utilities in those situations. But the data is showing that in many cases utilities is off, but maybe it was turned off before the extreme heat warning, and maybe it's been over a long period of time that they had not had utilities. So we're still trying to engage them in the conversation.
This gentleman right here.
So I just wanted to comment on Mike's description of, you know, the two apartments, because there is this kind of socioeconomic gradient where even within cities or across cities, you were saying that there were commercial versus religious organizations serving the kind of upper versus kind of more challenged economic communities. So then across these cities, though, you still have this situation where the better you do at closing the gap of AC coverage, the more and more kind of the lower the median income of the less leftover people becomes. So you are magnifying this socioeconomic problem the more successful you are. So then it just tells you that, you know, you've got some things that are working at odds, but it's not like you should stop doing the first thing. You should be mindful of this other thing. And also I like Brandy's comment about kind of dealing with proximate versus ultimate causes. And yes, you know, a cooling center and a hydration station can get someone to tomorrow so that they can then have an opportunity to get out of their situation. But in our interviews this summer, a lot of things like, you know, what's the best thing? You know, well, a case manager pulling that person out, and that's one, you know, potential effective thing. But I just think that there are lessons to be learned where Phoenix, among cities, not just the people, is a canary in the coal mine, and we can learn something here that I can show you.
I'll take one last question. He's had his hand up in the back for a long time.
So this is a great issue because there's such a need for intervention now to help people now. But we're pretty certain temperatures are going to increase over time, maybe as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. So I'd like your insight. If the temperatures do increase over time, will the impacts increase in a linear fashion, or will they increase in a nonlinear fashion? And are there maybe threshold points where we might experience some catastrophic type of change? And I know that was a 30-minute question asked with 15 minutes left to go.
You can start on that.
Yes. So if you look at the you know, the epidemiological studies that look at the temperature mortality curves or the temperature morbidity curves of what happens, this is not like linear, where, you know, the deaths or the hospitalizations go up with each degree of temperature. There is an exponential shape to the curve. And a lot of what we've been looking at is identifying what those threshold temperatures are and then seeing how that goes up. So we can think about, so you say 10 degrees by the end of the century, I'd say 5 degrees by mid-century or projections for this area. So when you start moving that curve, that temperature curve up, you're going to see exponential increases in health effects. That would be my projection.
I would say nonlinear too. So my concern is, I agree with Sharon that we are ahead of the curve when it comes to dealing with extreme heat. However, I'm also concerned that we could have a Katrina-like event, extreme heat Katrina-like event here. And I could see a few ways in which that could happen. I could see, for example, our physical systems, our engineering systems being knocked out by prolonged heat exposure or excessive heat exposure that they weren't designed for, that maybe knocks out a fuel line, and we don't have any refineries here. Fuel comes into us from Los Angeles or from Texas. So one of those lines go out like it did in 2003. All of a sudden we have no mobility, and people are therefore exposed to heat more longer, for more period of time. I could imagine more wildfires that knock out long distance electricity transmission. We have prolonged blackouts and brownouts, no air conditioning in certain places. These are going to be highly nonlinear responses to, you know, a hotter future.
All right, Ray, would you like to come up?
Yeah, I'll just speak for Mayor. So we're going to close now. I really appreciate you coming. All watch for some announcement for us for our November 5th and November 17th incidents, and be sure to contact Katie if we don't have your email, because that's generally how we try to communicate with people, make sure that she has your email.
Katie as well.
Katie, Katie, yes, Katie.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists, including Nancy, who had to